To understand how to checkmate the enemy king with your two bishops, let us first understand the goal that you have to achieve while doing this checkmate. So the enemy king can be checkmated on any one of the four corners of the board. So when you have a bishop pair, your goal is to drive the enemy king to one of these four corners. Because once the enemy king reaches the corner, it then becomes easier to checkmate the enemy king. Here is an example. As you can see, the game has been checkmated because the white king is controlling these two squares, the light square bishop is controlling this square, and the dark square bishop finally checkmates the king, controlling the only square where the king was standing. Here is another example. Black's king has reached to the corner of the board, and now white can easily checkmate the game by getting his bishop to the d5 square. Notice how again the white king is controlling these two squares, the dark square bishop is controlling this square, and the light square bishop finally delivers the checkmate. So now that you have seen how a bishop checkmate looks like, you now know that your goal is to drive the enemy king to the corner of the board. But the key question is, how do we do that? So let's understand with the help of this example. So there are certain steps that you have to follow in order to drive the enemy king to the corner of the board. So the first step is taking away the center squares from the enemy king. Since the enemy king is already aware of the fact that if he reaches to the corner of the board, he will get easily checkmated, he will try everything in his power to avoid going to the edge of the board or to the corner of the board. And the best place for him to be on the board is the center of the board. Because if he stays in the center, you will never be able to checkmate with your bishop pair. So the first step is take control of these four squares. And how do you take that? Well, it's simple. First, we will give check with our dark square bishop, which takes away these two squares from the enemy king. The king moves to the lighter squares. And now we will give check from our other bishop to take control of the light squares as well. Now, the enemy king is forced to leave the center. And now as you can see, both these bishops have taken control of the key center squares. Now we will execute step number 2, and that is getting both of your bishops side by side in these center squares. So we will first get our dark square bishop. Notice the enemy king cannot come to these squares, so he'll move to e3. And now we will get our other bishop to the center square. And now because of setting up your bishops in the center of the board, you have successfully created a wall against the enemy king. The enemy king cannot come on these squares because they are under our bishop's control. So the only safe squares left for the enemy king are these 12 squares. Black moves to d3, and now comes step 3. After you have successfully created a wall with your bishops, it's time to get your king into action. But where should we get our king? So the two important squares where you can get your king are these two squares. And the reason behind choosing one of these two squares is because by getting your king to one of these two squares, you are trying to create an opposition to the enemy king and also taking away more escape squares from this enemy king so that he is forced to go further down the board. So let's get our king to one of these two squares. Let's aim for this c4 square. Let's move. And now our king has reached to an important square. And as you can see, because of this king move, earlier Black's king had 12 squares. But right now, White king has also taken this square from him. So now he is left with only 11 squares. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. And because the king is already standing on this square, he is now forced to leave the third rank and now go to the second rank. That means when you try to get your king either to one of these two squares, you take away one square from the enemy king, forcing him to go down the board. Black moves to d2, and now comes the fourth step. And the fourth step is you have to get your king and your bishops moving into opposite directions so that you can force the enemy king to come to the edge of the board. And how exactly can you do that? Well, it's simple. Because you got your king from this to this square, it's time for our bishops to come one step down the board. But the tricky question over here is, which bishop should we move first? Well, the answer is simple. Do not make any move which gives counter-attack chances to your opponent. So for example, here in this case, if white gets its light square bishop one step down the board, then this would not be a good move because now the enemy king can come on the e3 square and attack this bishop. It is therefore in this scenario, we cannot move our light square bishop. So we will move our dark square bishop. So bishop comes to d4 square and now black king moves to e2 And now the light square bishop would also come down one step closer. Black moves here. And now again, our king needs to be in one of these squares to push the enemy king further down the board. Because now, as you can see, our bishops are already creating a wall. But this time, the number of squares available for the enemy king is half than what it had earlier. So if white is able to get his king either to this square or to this square, then he will be able to control one of these squares, because of which the enemy king would be forced to go to the edge of the board. But since white's king cannot come to this square right now, so he plays a waiting move. He gets his king to b3 square. Now, the black king is forced to come to the e2 square, and now our king can come to the c3 square. And as you can see, now the black king is forced to move to the side of the board, because now even this square has been taken away from him. So he has to go to one of these three squares. Black moves to d1, and now again it's time to get our bishop one step closer down the board. But again the key question is, which bishop should we play first? So if white plays this bishop, then black can easily attack this bishop. So this would not be the right move. So in this case, the right move would be bishop to d3, getting the light square bishop first. King moves to e1 square, and now the dark squared bishop comes down. King moves to d1, and now once the enemy king reaches the edge of the board, push him to one of the corners by taking control of his escape squares. And how exactly we can do that? Well, first let's look at how many squares the king has. The king cannot go on these squares as they are controlled by our bishop. So the king has only these two squares available where it can go back and forth. So since the king has this particular square, which is the e1 square, let's first take control of this e1 square. So we will play bishop f2, which takes away this square from the king. The king is forced to move to the c1 square, because earlier this square was being controlled by the dark square bishop. But now since the bishop has moved to this square and has taken control of this square, the king is now forced to come to the c1 square. So this way we are slightly pushing the king. Now the king cannot go to any of these squares because they are under the control of white's army. So the king has only these two squares available. So again, now we will take control of this square, which is the d1 square. So we will play bishop to e2, which takes control of this square as well. And now the king is forced to go to the b1 square. Now let's look at how many squares the enemy king has. 1, 2, 3. These are the 3 squares where it can go to. But because you are trying to force the enemy king to the corner of the board and you don't want him to escape the corner via the a2 square, it is therefore we will get our king to this square, giving a direct opposition to the enemy king and taking control of the squares in front of him. Now the enemy king has only two options, a1 and c1. If the king goes to the a1 square, then he has only one legal square available for him where he can go to, because these two squares are not available. So now is an important situation in the game, because if you try to take control of this square by playing a move like bishop to d3, then the game would immediately be stalemated. So when you're winning in the game, you don't want to play a hasty move, end the game in a draw. So therefore, in this situation, we will try to get our each bishop one by one closer to the enemy king. So here, instead of taking control of this square, we will first take control of this square. Because earlier, our bishops were taking control of these two squares, and now it's time that we take control of this c1 square. So that is why we will play bishop e3, which takes control of this square. Black has only one legal move, and that is king to b1. And now we can check the king with our light square bishop. King has to move into the corner. And now bishop d4 would be a checkmate. If you found this video helpful, then do like this video and subscribe to my channel. And if you want to master your skills in chess, then do join to the membership program. Here is the question of the day for you. It is white's turn in the game, and my question is, should white play king to e7? Comment with a yes or a no, and I'll see you in the next video. Until then, keep learning, keep practicing.